Hello, my name is Grace.
My name is Olivia.
My name is Rachel.
Welcome to our podcast discussing the research we have found on the orphan train movement. The orphan train has existed quietly in the back of American history for the last century, not widely shared or known about by modern Americans. Unlike the Underground Railroad, the orphan train was a literal train system. Dreamed up by social welfare advocates, it transported orphan and abandoned children from the streets of New York to farm families in the American Midwest. The train ran from 1854 to 1929 and transported 250,000 orphans.
The Children's Aid Society was a nonprofit group from New York that started the orphan train movement in response to the large number of children in New York City living in extreme poverty or homelessness. The Children's Aid Society published many newspaper advertisements in towns around the country that said, "Wanted, homes for children," and went on to describe the orphan's characteristics or list the requirements for adopting. These ads were similar to slave advertisements in the early 1800s, but not quite as crude. We found one ad in particular that was published on February 25th, 1910.
Antecedents of American Adoption by Burton C. Sokoloff of Princeton University examines the history of the adoption system in America. In the second half of the 1800s, the number of orphans wandering the streets of New York City grew due to poverty and crowded cities. These problems most affected immigrant families, such as those who emigrated after the Great Potato Famine. The orphan train came at a time in adoption history where the focus was finally starting to switch to the well-being of the child. Charles Loring Brace was a concerned social activist who came up with a solution. Out of compassion for the abandoned children on the streets of New York, he hatched a plan to set these children up with farm families in the Midwest. Help on the farms was greatly welcomed, and the children needed stable parents. To him, a win-win situation. He founded the Children's Aid Society, and then they started the orphan train. The orphan train was created out of sympathy for the children, but it wasn't always a caring system. Because most of the adoptive families were not thoroughly investigated and the adoptions not properly processed, some kids experienced mistreatment or abuse. The train was run by concerned citizens, not government officials, which explains some of the missteps or oversights that earned it criticism.
I found a specific article by the journal Modern American, which discussed the legal impact the orphan train movement had on adoption laws in America. The article states, quote, "The orphan train movement has been described as the driving force for changes to American adoption law, the creation of child labor laws, and reforming child welfare and foster care practices," end quote, Trammell, 2009. In reality, the orphan train movement was not the root cause for these changes and actually opened the door for reform in the system as a result of the movement's practices. Despite the majority of states having formal adoption laws, many of the children sent across the US were never formally adopted. Instead, some people cut corners to get the children to work as soon as they stepped off the train. This sort of cheating system became a legal issue when one or both of the adoptive parents died and the child could not inherit their estate or any property because they were not legally the landowner's children. This sparked the need for stricter adoption laws. Solutions such as almshouses were created, popular, but they proved to be very unsuccessful. Almshouses were essentially just locally administered public institutions for the homeless and elderly who didn't have a job. In response to the backlash almshouses received, many states passed legislation to put children in more appropriate homes. In the end, the movement itself actually contributed to the problem of child labor rather than pushing for reform.
The perspective of the orphans show the effect that this involuntary movement had on their development growing up. In an article written by social worker Jean Cook, she describes the conditions of the environment that the orphans were put into. The orphans were sometimes advertised with unappealing descriptions of poor and dirty, as they were treated as outcasts in the society that would guilt people into adoption, Cook, 1995. Rather than giving the children a supportive and healthy childhood, the adoptive parents promoted bad behavior by encouraging criminal favors. After the adoption process, some children were asked to steal and beg for financial gains. The orphans were treated as laborers rather than children. While some of the orphans endured trauma and never became upstanding citizens, others grew up to be quite successful. An example is Andrew H. Burke. Burke was born in New York City and rode all the way to Indiana, where he was adopted by farmers. He went on to enlist in the Civil War and receive a college degree before becoming the governor of North Dakota. Fortunately, some of the orphans persevered, gaining new knowledge and new experiences in life. Some were placed into healthy and well-functioning households, while others were placed into unhealthy conditions and unstable environments. This largely dictated their development and their overall well-being.
The success of the orphan train depends on who you talk to. To some people, it was a unique program that gave thousands of kids a new chance at life, and to others, it was a poorly developed system that caused more harm than necessary. And to many people, it wasn't purely a success or failure. The orphan train was a product of its time, and whether it existed for better or for worse, We probably won't see it happen again.